Hey, good morning, everybody. Great to see you. Our first week back. This is now our second, not our first gathering of the morning. So I had a great time at 8:15. Glad you're here today with us at 9:30 here in the room. Everybody online, good morning. Hey, before we jump into the new series, I do want to give you a date to kind of put in the back of your mind, and I hope you'll plan to be here for it. That is the last Sunday of this month, January the 29th. Is Vision Sunday. It's our next big Vision Day that I'm going to share some great, exciting things that are coming in the very near future for our church. If you were here last summer in June, our last one that we had, we kind of unveiled our plan over the next several years to, in part, start new churches within 30 minutes of our location here. And so one of the things I'm going to be updating on at Vision Sunday, end of the month, is where that first location is going to be, the pastor that's going to go out and plant that church, and all the plans that we have for that over the next 12 months to get that started. So be here on January 29th. It's going to be an exciting day for us here with our church family. But I'm glad you're here today, and we're kicking off a new series called Run the Play. And let me ask this question as we get started. We got any football fans in the room? Awesome. All right. We got anybody in the room who doesn't know the difference between a touchdown and a home run? Thanks for being honest. All right, that's fine. Cool. So let me go ahead and let you know over the next 3 weeks, even if that's you and you are not a sports person, have no idea what it's all about, you will not feel out of place over the next 3 weeks. I promise you that, all right? But we are kicking off this series called Run the Play. And, you know, when you think about where we are in the time of sports and kind of the calendar, we're coming up to the end of the football season. For those of you that aren't aware of that, about a month from now is the Super Bowl. Tomorrow night, 7:30 is the College National Championship game where the Texas Christian University Horned Frogs. Yeah, I got some amens and some laughs. Like, who came up with that mascot? I don't know. Anyway, TCU are going to face off against the University of Georgia Bulldogs. I know, I'm not a Georgia fan. I'm a Florida fan, so that's not a great day for me. But anyway, TCU and Georgia are going to take the field tomorrow night, decide who's the best college football team in the country this year. And when you think about how the end of that game is going to be determined, there are a couple things. There's a lot of things that go into determine who's going to win a game. But there's two things in every game that are incredibly important in who wins the game. The first is something called play calling. Right? What play are you going to call when? Having a good playbook, having a good plan. Having good plays that have been designed and knowing when to call the right play. It's incredibly important in any game, right? And you can guarantee that in these last several days and a week or so leading up to this game, both teams knowing they're going to be in the big show and the national championship game, there's been a lot of time spent on coming up with new plays, refining old plays, coming up with some trick plays that are going to be used at just the right time. But there's a lot that have gone into what play is going to be called when. But here's the thing, and even if you're not a sports person, you probably can understand this, that when it comes to whether or not you're going to win the game, or for that matter, if you're even going to really play the game, you have to at some point run the play, right? I mean, if the entire game tomorrow night was every time each team had the ball, they run out on the field, they huddle up, they call the play, they run to the line of scrimmage, and no one ever snaps the ball. That's not something you're going to pay any kind of good money to watch. You're not even going to waste your time on television. It's no fun if nobody ever actually runs the play. You got to run the play to play the game and certainly to have a shot at winning the game. But there's a second thing that's incredibly important, especially in a game of football and other games as well, other sports, that when it comes to determining who's going to win this game and get to the end and be victorious, is something that a lot of teams spend a lot of time working on, and that is clock management. How are you going to manage the clock during the game? Are you going to call this timeout early? Are you going to wait and use them at the end of the game? Are you going to run out of bounds to stop the clock, take a knee inbounds to keep the clock running? How you manage the clock during the game oftentimes determines whether or not you have enough time to run that last play to maybe win the game. Clock management is incredibly significant when it comes. And it's not just a theory. Coaches talk about it. Players are coached on it. There's a lot that goes into how you're going to manage the clock. And in case you're wondering what this has to do with us today and with the Bible and with our lives as Christians, the fact is the same is true of every one of us. How we manage the clock from the moment we're born till we take our last breath is incredibly significant. Clock management, the way we use, here's the word that we're going to talk about today, our time. The way we manage our time, use our time, take care of our time, steward our time. It's incredibly significant. In fact, this is, many would say, one of the most important commodities that we have. And And what's interesting is it's the one thing that we've been given that every one of us has the exact same amount in any given day. Would you agree with that, right? I mean, we might not have the same amount of days over the course of our life, the same amount of years that we live, but from the beginning of a day to the end of the day, every one of us have the exact same amount of time to use, to steward, and to manage. And it's funny when you think about time. We are consumed with the idea of time. Specifically, we are really good at asking this question right here. What time is it? Think about how many times a day you ask what time it is. In fact, just before I finish this message, you're going to check to see what time it is and how I'm doing. I guarantee it. Some of you more than once, right? Which is really funny because we consistently let you out within the same 3 to 5 minutes every single week, but you're going to check to see if this is the week that I really messed that up really bad, right? And so let me go ahead and just kind of ease your mind at that. First off, a couple thoughts about when we get out. In 24 years of being a church, we've never given an ending time to a service, so I'm never late letting you out, all right? And on top of that, we got a clock with great big red LED letters on the back wall that's actually 2 minutes fast. Nobody knows that except me, except now everybody knows it. Anyway, it's a couple minutes fast on purpose, right? So that we can actually hurry up to let you out on time. Anyway, so I know that's what some of you are really worried about, but there are also moments we're consumed with time. Society's consumed with time. People are consumed with time. But there's also those moments when we forget about time. That ever happened to you? Like some of you, it happens all the time. Some of you are really good at forgetting what time it is and being late. Like there's people on our staff that sometimes are well, you just know that's Pedro time. I'm sorry, Pedro. I didn't mean to throw you under the bus today. I love you, brother. Anyway, that's a whole name for it. Anyway, that's when you know you've known somebody for a really long time. But you're doing things. This ever happened to you? You ever been doing like a hobby? Like that's fun, reading a book or gardening or dusting. I don't know, maybe that's a hobby of yours. But you're in the middle of doing something you really enjoy doing, and all of a sudden you look up and you're like, oh my word, look at the time, right? Or you're engrossed in a really great conversation over a cup of coffee, and you realize all of a sudden it's a lot later than you thought it was, and you're late to something. What do you say? I just lost track of the time. Fact is, we live with a constant awareness of time. We have alarm clocks to tell us when to get up, reminders to tell us when to get things done at a certain time. And as we enter into this new year, I know it's that resolution season, and this is not really a resolution type of series. All right, let me go ahead and say that out front. But as we start the new year, I think there's a better question for us to ask than to ask what time it is. I think the better question you and I should always be asking ourselves is, what am I doing with my time? Like the time that I have, what am I doing with it? How am I using it? When I get up in the morning, how do I think about the reason I've been given the time that I have been given? Now, I'm sure being a new year, there's all kinds of resolutions that you have set as it relates to time. Like some of you maybe want to spend more quality time with your family or more time with friends or time for self-care or whatever else it might be. But this subject of how we use time, it is not just a New Year's resolution kind of a subject. Scripture speaks very bluntly, very directly, and very often about what we choose to do with the time that we've been given. And so what I want to do today is I want to look at one of the scriptures in the Bible that speaks a lot and very plainly about how you and I use and what we do with our time. It's one of the Psalms. And this particular psalm might be written by someone that you might find surprising wrote any of the Psalms. Like if I were to ask you, who do we attribute most of the Psalms to, you would say what? David, that's right. David, the second king of Israel, man after God's own heart, absolutely is responsible for writing a majority of the Psalms. But this psalm is not one of his. It's actually written by someone you might not even be aware that wrote any of the Psalms. It's written by Moses. Moses, yes, that Moses. Moses wrote the psalm that we're going to read today, and it's the 90th psalm. If you have a Bible and want to turn and follow me, it'll, of course, be on the screen as well. But Moses, that guy, one of the other most famous, important, significant fixtures in Jewish history, right? David is one of them. Moses is definitely the father in many ways of, obviously Abraham is the father of the nation of Israel, but in so many ways spiritually, Moses was that father that led them out of Egypt to become the people that God had called them to be. And he writes this psalm, and I want to delve into what he has to say because specifically he talks a lot about how you and I need to think about, use, and approach the time that we've been given. Here's what he says in verse 1 and 2. He says, Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Not only this generation, but in all generations. And then he says, before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. The boundary of your dwelling place, here's what you need to take away from it. The boundary of your dwelling place, the boundary of your life is not you're born and you die. According to Moses, the boundary of your life is everlasting to everlasting with God at the center of all of it. That's Moses' argument. That's what he's saying right here. The boundary of your life, the context of your life. The bookends are not just that one day you were born, you took your first breath, there's coming a day you're going to take your last, and that dash in between that people talk about all so often, that's really the context of your life. No, Moses says it's much greater than that. It's actually the fact that from everlasting to everlasting. Before you ever breathed a breath, God knew you. And after you take your final breath, that will not be all that there is. From everlasting to everlasting, God at the center of all of it. That's the context of your life. And if that is true, what Moses is getting at is that the only way you and I will ever make sense of our existence, which, let's just be honest, is what most of us spend the majority of our lives trying to do. Make sense of our existence. And it manifests itself in all kinds of different ways. But most of us spend the majority of our life trying to make sense out of our life. The only way you're actually going to make sense of it, family, work, right? I know people that think, oh, my purpose in life is family. And then at some point you're like, well, if my purpose in life is just family and it's just to procreate, then that's kind of a pointless point as well sometimes, right? I mean, we can get discouraged about what the point of work is. Why do I go to work and do this job every day? At some point, you're going to be really excited and have grandiose ideas about how your job is going to change the world. And at some point, you're going to be, this is pointless. Well, my job, I can't wait to get to retirement so I can enjoy all this, right? The only way you're going to make sense of any of that, family, work, church, retirement, friendship, any of it, according to Moses, is understanding this context from everlasting to everlasting with God at the center. And then here's why. He says this in the next verse. Because you return man, speaking to God, Moses saying to God, God, you return man to dust, and you say, return, O child of man. Here's what Moses is saying here. That no matter who you are, no matter what you know, no matter what you accomplished, eventually your life returns to dust, no matter who you are. And who's saying this? Moses. Moses is saying, if you think your life is something that it's not, don't be deceived about what your life is. It's actually going to return to dust. It came from dust, it's going to return to dust, just like his life came from dust and is returning to dust. And again, this is Moses saying this. And think about who this guy Moses is. He's the guy that talked to God in front of a bush that was on fire but never burned up. I guarantee you that's never happened in your life. It's never happened in mine. Best I can tell in history, there's only ever been this one time that happened. Moses, the guy who foretold these plagues are going to happen. All 10 of them to Egypt. The guy who parted the Red Sea, led people across it, turned around and closed the Red Sea. Now, I don't know ways in which you've ever seen the power of God kind of demonstrated and show up in your life. I've seen that happen in my life, but never, ever once like that. Never been a moment where I said, hey, God, can you part these waters? Ain't happened to me. If I could have, I would have done it when I was 16 years old and got my dad's Bronco so stuck in the mud. We had to get a tow truck to pull it out the next day, and I lost my driver's license for 6 months. That was a moment, all right, in history. In fact, forever, my dad said the day my son turned 16, he was going to call him up and say, Tanner, go get your daddy's truck and let's go for a ride. That's why I kept that old Suburban all those years, by the way, for those of you who know that I kept it for 400,000 miles. Anyway, point being, I've seen God show up and do amazing things. I've never seen and experienced personally being able to do the things that Moses did. Moses is the guy that was literally given the 10 commandments. The 10 commandments, right? And what does Moses say about his life? At some point, my life's going to return to dust. From dust we came, from dust we return. This is Moses. And if anyone's life could have a lasting significance beyond his life, it would have been his. And what does he say? In the end, our life is dust. Aren't you glad you're here? Happy New Year. Okay? And here's why he says that. Because for 1,000 years in God's sight, 1,000 years to us in your sight, God, are but as yesterday when it is past, or as a watch in the night. We've heard this idea before, most of us. 1,000 years to the Lord is as a day is 1,000 years. Peter wrote that, by the way, in the New Testament. But more than 1,000 years before Peter wrote it, Moses wrote it. God, a day to us, to you is like 1,000 years. 1,000 years to us is like one single solitary day to you. And then I love this analogy even more, or it's like a watch in the night. Now, what is a watch in the night? Well, back then, they would divide the night into watches, and they would set guards to watch the city or the camp. They would have first watch and the second watch and the third watch of the night. You're familiar with all of that. 3-4 hours or so, that's really what a watch was. And so what Moses is saying is that, you know what, we can even use this analogy. We can dial it down more, that 1,000 years in our context is like a watch in the night to you, God. It's like a few hours, okay? So here's kind of a depressing thought. Yeah, I just said that. Here's a depressing thought if you want to think about it, all right? If that is true, if this right here is true, how long is your life in God's perspective? If 1,000 years is like 3 hours, your life, it's about 15 minutes. In the span of everlasting to everlasting, your life's about 15 minutes long, which means at the time we're here in this room this morning, every one of us could be born and die 4 times. Like that's the context of our lifespan in the eyes of God. And you're like, man, Brian, you're just full of all kinds of uplifting, encouraging things on this January 8th, right? But seriously, that's how short and inconsequential our lives are in context of eternity. And yet Moses, as depressing as that might sound, he's not done yet. Here's what he goes on to say in the next verse. You sweep through them, God. You sweep through our life as with a flood, like grass that's renewed in the morning. In the morning it flourishes and it's renewed, but in the evening it fades and it withers. Now, you've heard this analogy probably all your life, and you've been around church many years. You've heard it a long, long time. There's bumper stickers and posters and whatever else, all kinds of little trinkets you can get in your house that uses this verse or something like that. That God, you renew me in the morning like the grass. They just leave this last part out, that in the evening you fade and wither, right? It's not very motivational. But before Hobby Lobby ever had that on something you could put on your wall, Moses said it. That your life is like grass that in the morning God renews with the dew and it springs up and it's got all of this vitality and strength. And in the evening, the heat of the day just withers it and it falls. That's what your life is like, and that's what mine is like. Now, here's where I really want you to dial in with me for a minute, okay? In case you checked out because this sounded like a really depressing New Year kind of a message. We're about to turn the corner on why this matters. Moses' point, and I want you to listen. I want you to hear this. Moses' point is not that your life does not matter. His point is not that your life is insignificant. His point is not that your life has no meaning, even though it might sound and feel that way when you read these words. Moses' point is that it is futile for you and for me to try and create meaning and purpose and significance on our own, because the truth is we just don't have enough time. We don't have enough time between everlasting and everlasting on the short time that we're on this earth to invent and to create meaning and purpose and significance on our own. Our existence is way too brief to do that, because our life is like grass that's renewed in the morning and withers in the evening. At best, it's 15 minutes, and our 15 minutes of fame is not enough to do that much from everlasting to everlasting. And here's why we don't have time to invent significance and meaning during that 15 minutes of our life. Here's what he says in verse 10. The years of our life are 70 or even 80 by reason of strength, and yet the span of our life is but toil and trouble. They're soon gone and we fly away. Now here's what's interesting. In Moses' lifetime, the average lifespan was, according to Moses, 70 or 80 years. Sounds pretty normal, right? Not so different from us today. And what does Moses say those 70 or 80 years are going to be filled with? 2 things. What are they? Toil and trouble. Anybody found that to be true? Again, I'm not trying to be Debbie Downer here, but it's just true, right? I mean, literally, yesterday I was trying to put a file cabinet together. 3.5 hours to put a little file cabinet together. In the middle of it, literally in the instructions, in the middle of the instructions, it says, if you're still doing this in one shot, maybe stop and have a snack That's what it said in the instructions. I'm not kidding. I'm like, yep. Yes, it did. All right. Anyway, life is filled with toil and trouble. And yet the days of our 70 or 80 years or whatever they might be, they're gone before you know it. How many of you, I used to remember when I was a kid, it felt like, it took forever for Christmas to come. And then you get older and you hear all the adults saying, oh, wait till you get older, time just flies. You're like, no, it's never going to happen. It feels like Christmas comes once every 6 years when you're a kid, and when you're an adult, it's like, didn't we just do this last month? Like it flies so fast. And because that's true, what Moses is saying is that's the reason why. Your life, number one, is so short in the context of eternity. And even the days that you have, they're filled and overwhelmed most of the time with toil, which is a result of the fall, by the way. Go back to Genesis. We don't have time to do that today. And within that toil, you're going to find trouble. That's going to characterize the majority of your days. And then this next verse is confusing when you first read it, but it's the key to understanding the point of all of it, I believe. Here's what he says in the next verse. Who considers the power of your anger and your wrath according to the fear of you? Now, we read this, and I think sometimes we get sidetracked by two of the words in here, the words anger and wrath, and we're like, well, who considers your anger and your wrath? Anger and wrath is not actually the main point of this verse. The main point of the verse are the words that are highlighted. Who considers, who stops and reflects and really dwells on what? The power of God that would result in you and I having a fear of God. Now, you're like, well, that doesn't sound a whole lot better, Brian. Well, it's because something really gets lost in translation in this verse. In Hebrew, that this verse was written, they had a much deeper, different understanding of the power of God, even the wrath and anger of God, and certainly the fear of God. Fear of God, and you might know this, doesn't mean to be afraid of God. It means to revere God, to respect God. Like there are people in my life when I was a kid that I had a healthy fear of. I wasn't scared of my grandfather or my dad, but there was a healthy fear when mom said, wait till your dad gets home. Nobody ever wanted dad to come home. It wasn't because I didn't want dad to come home, but I knew that there was going to be something to pay when he got home. My grandfather was a godly man. I loved him, but there was a respect, a revering that I had for who he was. I wasn't afraid of him, but I had a healthy, godly, good fear of him. You follow what I'm saying? And so when Moses writes, who considers the power of God, the anger of God, the wrath of God, so that we would fear God, here we read it and we have trouble translating it. So here's what I want to do. I want to take the liberty and paraphrase this for you and for us as to what I think Moses means by this. And you can check me on this later, please. I would encourage you to do that. But here's what I think Moses is getting at with this verse. Here's what he means. If we could see God as he is, which, if we're honest, is one of the biggest struggles we all have, seeing God as he truly is. In fact, how many times have you said or heard somebody say, well, I like to think of God like, you ever heard that? Ever said that? Can I be direct? Doesn't matter what you think of God like. It matters of what God is actually like, right? And what Moses is saying is that if you and I could see God for who he is and what he is and as he actually is, two things would happen. And here's the two things that would happen. We would give God the respect he deserves, and we would live our life for the purpose that he designed. This is Moses' argument. Who considers the power of the Lord, his anger and his wrath, that we would fear him? What he's saying is this: if you could see God as he is, you would have a respect for God that's different than the current respect you have for him. You would respect him differently. You would fear him, revere him, honor him differently. And because you respected and revered who he was, because you saw him as he is, the next thing you would do is live your life for the purpose that he designed. Not you designed, that he designed. And here's Moses' conclusion to this whole endeavor. Here's the way you and I get to the place where we actually can see God as he is, respect him as he deserves, and live for the purpose he designed. Here's how that happens. He says, so teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Teach us to number our days. Some translations will say, teach us to number our days correctly or rightly, that we would get or gain a heart of wisdom. When you embrace the reality that God has given you days on this earth, and those days are limited, and those limited days have a purpose, and the center of that purpose is not you, and when you choose instead to live out those days with God as the center of that purpose between everlasting and everlasting, that is where you and I gain the heart of wisdom that we need, that will teach us to number our days wisely for the purpose for which they were created. And here's why it's not a bad thing that the center of your life is not about you. And you do realize that, right? I mean, I think we all realize that. We just don't like admitting that. I'm as guilty as the next person. I know that I'm not the center of the universe, but I sure like being the center of mine. And every one of us, I'm sure, feels the same way. But here's why it's not only okay, but it's great news for you that your life is not the center of your life and the purpose for which your life was created. Because if it was, if your life was only about you or all about you or even mostly all about you, you know what that means? It means the only purpose to your life would be the 70 or 80 or 50 or 30 years or however many days that your life is on this earth. That would be the only point to your life. If the point of your days was only about you, I would argue there would actually be no real point. Not really. Because the moment your days are done, so is the point of your days. But because your 70 or 80 or 30 years of days is actually sandwiched between everlasting and everlasting with God at the center of all of it, it means that if you and I will learn to number our days correctly, then everything about our days has meaning and purpose far beyond the days we live them on this earth. And it's the only way that is true. To put it bluntly, your life and my life matters because we're not the point. That's why our life matters. And the center between everlasting and everlasting is the God who created you for a good purpose. That's what gives you meaning. That's what makes your life matter. And because it matters, how you spend your time matters. So here's what I want to do in the last, 10, 12, 13, 28 minutes or so. Literally, about half of you look back at the clock. That's great. What I want to do in the last few minutes before we wrap this up is I want to leave you with a few very tangible takeaways, because all that I've said right now, I'm sure that most of you probably agree with that. I doubt I've said anything that anybody here is going, well, that's just wrong. That's just crazy. You probably, I agree with that. I can see that. I can go there. And it's also very vague and kind of in this big realm of, okay, that's theoretical, that's doctrinal, theological, that's a great word. Thank you for that. Well, I want to send you away with some takeaways, some very tangible takeaways. 4 things I want to give you, 2 statements and 2 questions. And let me give you this disclaimer up front. These are not 4 steps to better time management. It's not what I'm about to do. What I am going to do is give you 2 statements to think through with me this morning that will lead into 2 questions that I think we all need to ask ourselves every day of our 15 minutes that we are on this earth between everlasting and everlasting. Here's the first statement that I want you to consider with me for just a minute. How you spend your time is more about who you become than what you get done. How you spend your time. The real end result of how you spend it, it's really not about the things that you get done in that amount of time. How you spend your time says an awful lot. It says everything about who you are going to become. I mean, the hard truth is that what you spend the majority of your time doing molds your life far more than the things you think or believe. And I'm not saying the things you think or believe are unimportant. They most certainly are important. But you can think something and you can believe something, but what you do shapes you more than just what you think or you believe. You know that to be true, right? We all do. Let me give you a very simple example. How many of you are from an area of the country that has a very strong accent? Several of you. Any New Englanders in the room? Wow, just a couple of you. There were several at 8:15. I think more at 8:15. All right, New England, they got a notorious kind of accent, right? How about Minnesota? Yeah. Minnesota. That's right. They like to go out in the boat. I actually had somebody from Minnesota back here at 8:15, and they're like, yes, good job. All right, thank you. See, when you're from Minnesota, it's not Minnesota, it's Minnesota. It's boat. You got to go up, right? Anyway, not that you need a voice lesson. How about Alabama? Any Alabama folks in here? Proud Alabama folks. So we don't understand what y'all are saying most of the time. I'm sorry. I love you, but it's confusing. My wife has family from Mobile area, which it's not even Alabama. It's just its own unique country, I think, around part of that country. Anyway, we were around them. I remember when our kids were younger, probably 12, 13, around in there. Hadn't spent a lot of time with that side of the family, but we were together, some big family reunion, and we're leaving, and my kids are both like, hey, they're really, really nice, but they talk weird. I can't understand them. I'm like, yeah, it's all right. It's all good, right? But how many of you found this to be true? If you've moved away from that area, and you don't talk like that anymore until you go back for a visit. And your kids are like, Mom, why are you talking like that? So weird, right? Why? Because what you do affects who you become way more than what you just think or what you believe or what you know to be true. I mean, think about the words of Jesus. You remember the time he told the parable about the Pharisee who was standing in the temple looking around and praying to God, God, I thank you that I'm not like all these other sinners, especially like this tax collector over here, but I'm much, much different. I pray twice a day, right? I tithe, I fast, I do all of these things. And what does Jesus say? Basically, yeah, well, in doing all of those things, you've missed the point because you're actually not as close to the heart of the Father as the tax collector over here who humbled himself and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Why? Because the goal and the purpose of tithing and praying and fasting and all of those things is not to get them done. The purpose of those things was to help you become something that you're not. What you do is about becoming, not just getting things done. And so what about you? You just ask the question very directly. What does the way that you spend the majority of your time actually say about who you're becoming? Next statement I want you to consider with me is this statement. The most pressing is not always the most important. Can I get an amen on that? Some of you are like, is it? The most pressing thing in your life is not always the most important thing in your life. You know, I remember when our kids were younger, sometimes it felt like we needed a spreadsheet just to figure out where we needed to be every hour of the day. You ever feel like that? Man, a lot of heads nodding on this one. I mean, it's just like you're going here, your kids got sports and activities and school, and you got work and church and everything else. It's just like, my goodness, life is just chaotic and crazy, and we never can catch our breath. And so one night, I remember, this was years ago, after just a really incredibly chaotic week, my wife and I looked at each other and were like, this is ridiculous. We gotta do something about this. We gotta fix this. And we sat down and we wrote down, and those of you that know my wife, you know she's a list maker. She has lists for lists, right? So, and we make this list of everything that we have going on, all of our responsibilities in a day and a week, and everything the kids had to be. And it was way more than any one family should be doing in any given day. And then as we started looking at the list, we realized everything on this list actually fit into one of three categories. Everything fit under the category either of what we would call a non-negotiable, or a priority, or a responsibility. That everything that we were running around doing, it's in one of these categories, right? A non-negotiable, priority, or responsibility. And here's what we found. That we were organizing our week first and foremost around all of our responsibilities. Which you might say, well, of course, that's the responsible thing to do, right? No. Following through on your responsibilities is the responsible thing to do. Letting your responsibilities dictate and affect and limit the things that are most important is actually irresponsible. But we would start our week by, all right, what do we got to get done? What are we responsible for? Let's make sure we get all that carved in. And then we'd move to our priorities, things that were important. And you know what would happen? because we would start with our responsibilities and then make sure all the things that were priorities got done, that the things that were non-negotiable for us, the things that were, in other words, most important, most of the time there was little to no time left at the end of the day for them. Little to no time left to work on our relationship, little to no time left to spend time alone with God, little to no time left as a family to do the things that we say are most important to us. And so we made a decision, like, we're going to flip this upside down, and we're going to start with what's most important. And we're going to start our schedule with those things. And then what are the things that are top priorities after that? And you know what our non-negotiables were? There was actually only 3 of them. Our individual relationship with God, our relationship with each other as husband and wife, and our family. Those were our 3 most important things. And so let's start there. And what do we need to do to make sure those things are what they need to be? And after that, all right, then what's a priority? And after that, what are we responsible for? And you know what we found happened? Is that we weren't trying to figure out how to take care of the things that were most important. We started with the things that were most important. And then we also found that some of the things that we were responsible for, we didn't actually have time to be responsible for, which meant we had to start saying no, which is what most of us don't like to do. And inevitably, saying no, you know what it does? It offends somebody because they understand and they think this is great until you saying no affects their thing. I remember one time I had to say, look, it's not because I don't love you. I'm just not Jesus. I'm not God. I don't have everlasting to everlasting. I got 15 minutes. So I want to ask you, when it comes to organizing your time, the most impressive thing is not always the most important. And so this leads me to the second question and the last thing I want to ask you this morning. And it's this: can you say, honestly, how can you answer this question? Is my time organized around what matters most? Can we honestly say that? Is my time truly organized around what matters most? And I'm not saying you can't have other things you're responsible for. You should have other things you're responsible for. You could help and take ownership of things and do more. I get all of that. But you can't do everything. And I found, and I'm speaking as a student of this as much as a teacher, maybe even more so, that if I don't start by organizing my time around what's most important first, generally speaking, I never get around to them. And you know why we never get around to them? It's because we all say a word that might be one of the most dangerous words in the English language when it comes to answering this question correctly. It's the word someday. And someday we will. Someday when I graduate. Someday when I get that promotion. Someday when the kids are out of the house. Someday when we retire. Someday when we have enough money. Someday when we aren't so busy. Someday. Can I be blunt? You aren't guaranteed someday. And neither am I. I'm not guaranteed another minute. I mean, the sports world was reminded of that this last week, weren't they? Damar Hamlin's heart stops on the field of the Bills-Bengals game. Man, what an outcry and prayer, and it looks like things are going better, but man, we're not guaranteed someday. Which leads me to the final question that I want to ask actually, in regards to all this. And this one's pretty direct, but I hope you'll ask this question and take this question for what it's meant to be. When it comes to someday, am I wasting today with the excuse of someday? There's far more days in the 49 years in the past of my life that I would have to answer yes to that than I really would care to admit. I've wasted more todays on the excuse of someday than I ever should have, and you probably have too. I'm not here to live in the past and feel all guilty and shamed about all of that, but I am here to ask this question right now, today. Are you still wasting today under the excuse of someday? Yesterday, about 100 of us gathered in this room for a memorial service for a longtime member of our church, Ken Lininger. About 20 years, I had the privilege of being Ken's pastor. He sat right back there every single Sunday. Second row from the back, chair on the aisle. He'd get here 30 minutes early so he could get his seat. Ken was a locksmith for 40 years at Disney. At one point or another, he fixed or rekeyed almost every lock in this church and building and in the last building that we were in. He just served and gave, always willing to do it. But yesterday, and I know she's okay with me sharing this, his wife Peggy asked if I would read a letter. And I did. And at the end of the letter, she talks about one of the last things that Ken said to her, just a day or two before he passed. They were talking, and he looked at her, and he just said, "I'm sorry." And trying to lighten the mood, and if you knew Ken, he had a really great sense of humor, a very dry, sarcastic sense of humor. And so trying to lighten the mood a little, she says, Sorry for what? Being a great husband, being a great father, being a good guy, working hard, people liking you, what are you sorry for? He said, for cutting out early. But here's why that statement wasn't tragic. It's sad, yes. It's emotional, yes. But it was not tragic. And the reason why it was not tragic is because Ken did not live his life like this, wasting today with the excuse of someday. He wasn't a saint. He wasn't perfect. He would not want me to paint him as that. But he did understand he had a limited number of days, and he was going to use them to the best of his ability for the glory of God and for the benefit of those around him. And he wasn't going to wait for someday. He was going to do something today. And when it comes to how we manage the play clock of our lives, when you walk out these doors, don't just line up and call the play. Like, don't just sit here today and go, you know what? Yes, I agree. I need to be a better manager of my time, and walk out this door and change nothing. Run the play. Get up in the morning and say, God, how do I organize my time today that you've given me, this 15 minutes between everlasting and everlasting? How do I use it today through the lens that you are God? That I can see you for who you are, respect you for who you are, and as a result, live my life for the purpose that you designed. Loving you, seeking you, loving others. Not wasting another today under the excuse of someday. Run the play. Organize your time around what matters most. And I'm not going to stand here today and tell you what that has to be, the way that needs to look. I think there are a few things that it will look similar. It should look the same for every one of us. I think God ought to be the most important thing in your life, and your family ought to be next. I do believe that. But I'm not going to give you a list of priorities that you should and shouldn't make. I'm simply going to beg you, ask you, plead with you based on what Moses said. And he learned 3,200 years ago that our life is fleeting. It's like dust. It's going to come and it's going to go. You don't have time to invent significance and meaning and purpose on your own. You've been given a purpose by God. So live that purpose in your 15 minutes between everlasting and everlasting, and walk out these doors today and start doing it. Run the play. Let's pray together. Father God, I thank you that you designed us for a purpose, and that the meaning of our life and the purpose of our life and the significance of our lives is not something we have to invent and come up with, because we don't have enough time to do that. But the purpose and significance of our life you've given us. And if we will live each day in the context of our life between everlasting and everlasting with you at the center of it, everything we do will be filled with purpose and meaning and significance that will far outlive us, because we're not the point of it anyway. You are. And God, may we live today and every day with that understanding. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.